China could be declared a national security threat after Britain and America accused it of cyber attacks targeting personal information of politicians, of journalists and of millions of you, ordinary voters.
Well, the pressure is actually on to sanction China further after growing criticism of the government that it has not gone far enough.
Joining us to discuss this, former Head of Counterterrorism at the Ministry of Defence, Major General Chip Chapman, and former Liverpool MP Crossbench Peer, Lord David Alton. Lord Alton, if I could start with you. Good morning to both of you. What's your own personal experience of all of this?
Well, 3 years ago yesterday, I was one of 7 parliamentarians who were sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party, and yesterday was one of 4 who were invited to meet with the security service to a confidential discussion about some of the threats that parliamentarians and the country are facing. I think the real concern I have, having listened to the statement by Oliver Dowden yesterday, is that he said this was robust. And he said it was a strong response. But it seemed to be neither of those things to me. It wasn't robust, it wasn't strong. He also said it was swift. Well, it's 3 years since sanctions were imposed on parliamentarians. And Ian Duncan Smith has used this metaphor about the elephant giving birth to a mouse. Well, it's a bit like, if I can use a different metaphor, it's like closing the door once the horse has bolted. 3 years ago, many of us said, the House of Lords Committee said, the Intelligence and Security Committee said that we had to regard China as a threat.
Right, OK, so why hasn't it not been regarded as the threat you believe it actually is? And I put it to you, that is because trade and China is worth too much to this country. Yes, indeed. And that's a point I've regularly brought out, that we have got ourselves so indebted that we become dependent. Do you know what the trade deficit this year is with China? It's a staggering £50 billion. So they're 50 billion better off in this deal than we are? They are indeed. And if you go back to COVID, for instance, one example, we spent £13 billion on things that we could have bought within our own country, made in our own country, instead of which we bought from the Chinese Communist Party's regime. And, of course, some of it's made by slave labour, exploited labour, so, of course, you can get it cheap. Look at what they've done in Xinjiang. There are 1 million Uyghur Muslims incarcerated there. Look at what they've done in Hong Kong, where they've destroyed not just a treaty made between China and Britain, an international treaty. There are 1,700 political prisoners in the prisons in Hong Kong. Daily there are threats to Taiwan. You think about the dreadful things that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for, and what do we do in response? This is weak and half-hearted. In short, you say half-hearted there. In short, this is all bluster. There is no structure to all of this. It's to make it look as if we care, as if we're upset about this, but actually China holds all the trump cards. It's weak and it's limp. It's not a strategic response to what has happened. We've made ourselves dependent. We should be making ourselves resilient against the greatest threat this country faces. It's at the apex. China is at the apex of the threat. With it, in the axis of authoritarian regimes, are Russia, North Korea and Iran. This represents an enormous threat to this country, and we needed more than the statement that we had in the House of Commons yesterday. It all boils down to politics, though, doesn't it, in all of this, because it's not going to win elections if we're going to be financially worse off by cutting off China in any harsher way than we have with these very meagre sanctions, as you point out. And you also look to who's responsible for this. Well, you've got Lord Cameron, who cozied up to them in the first place. He's not even being, some would say, democratically accountable, not addressing the Commons, even able to attend the House of Parliament, the Commons on this. And then you've got Rishi Sunak, former Chancellor, who's always worried about the money and getting re-elected rather than perhaps the national interest. Well, that's quite true. The first minister we sent to Hong Kong wasn't a foreign minister, well, foreign office minister, it wasn't a defence minister, it was a trade minister. Why are we trying to deepen trade with the Chinese Communist Party? Well, was that not because their foreign office counterpart had gone missing? They didn't have a foreign secretary in China because they'd just disappeared at one point. But we sent a trade mission to Hong Kong. This had nothing to do with whether they had a foreign minister or not. We were trying to deepen our trade, just like the Golden Age that David Cameron promoted in the past. It's extraordinary to me that one of the 4 great officers of state, and I say this as someone who's sat in both the Commons and the Lords, is held by someone in the House of Lords. It should be held in the House of Commons. There are plenty of people. We heard Sir Ian Duncan Smith in the news clip earlier on. He's a former leader of the Conservative Party. I'd much rather see him at the helm. But there are other people
There are people who've been Prime Minister who sit in the House of Commons.
Well, David Cameron was Prime Minister as well, and he went for a pint with the Chinese president in Oxford, didn't he? You think those pictures haunt him now?
Well, I hope that they do, because he needs to both recant to that period, the golden era, which was anything but, and recognise that the indebtedness of this nation to China places us in a parlous and perilous position. This is dangerous. It is a strategic threat, and we should say so. It should be in the enhanced tier as well, which we've failed to do. We make it up as we go along. The Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament wrote a report that was held back last year for months on end. And finally, when it was published, it even named David Cameron in that report as saying that the work that he'd done in building up the Belt and Road initiatives, which have been worth $1 trillion in debts to third world nations, money that is now owed to the People's Republic of China. David Cameron was personally involved in that.
Listen now as we bring in Major General Chip Chapman on this one from a security point of view, all of this. Major General, you've listened to what Lord Alton has had to say. What can we do, if anything, that could be deemed as effective against China?
Well, it's used as a tool of subversive statecraft by China. The difficulty is often to do with attribution. So determining what machine or networks have done the attacks is challenging at the best of times, and a hacker or intrusive operator can mask that. So you often have plausible deniability. Now, we know that China do this on a regular basis, and advanced persistent threats were mentioned in terms of the reconnaissance of the parliamentarians. That is very dangerous because, of course, they can micro-target, as they attempted to do, for example, with other forms in Cambridge Analytica in 2016. Yeah. Whereas our security agencies have to work within a legal, ethical and a regulatory framework. The Chinese don't do that, so they can micro-target, for example, in the next election, in constituencies to remove people who are critical to them, such as Ian Duncan Smith. So we can defend forward actively, and the UK, GCHQ and the American NSA are cyber superpowers, which in extremis could degrade, defeat and disrupt the Chinese networks themselves.
Are you in effect saying there that you don't think we're going to face a fair election in this country in 2024 because of this cyber threat? Quite an extraordinary thing to say.
Well, if you look at why the Electoral Commission was hacked, the big thing about data is not just the data which came from the Electoral Commission. It's metadata, which is a thing which always concerns us. That's data about data. And the more data you have on people, the more you can influence those people by this micro-targeting, either via social media, disinformation and things like that. So if you had a number of vociferous critics of the Chinese in various constituencies, there could be that micro-targeting in those areas, because it's only really sort of generally about 5% of people who change their minds in elections, which could alter the outcome of a constituency election.
The measures that were announced by Oliver Dowden yesterday done enough, do you think, to now make our elections this year free and fair?
Probably not, but the security agencies will be looking into the intrusion of these networks. It's very difficult to do because it's networks, it's servers, it's software, it's hardware. It's a contested environment, and the internet and the architecture of the internet was never designed to be contested. That's the big weakness of it.
Chip, China can do what it wants, absolutely do what it wants. You heard Lord Alton talk about the 50 billion trade deficit with them. We're in financial hock to them. They own half of this country. You look at London, they own so much of that as well. We look at the COVID situation. It seems to be widely accepted that it originated in a lab in China and no one has done anything about it. I mean, I think that's more important than interfering with elections even. But no one has said to China, "Oi, what was all that about? We know you were behind it." And nobody is saying or doing anything about it or holding them accountable. So they win. They win, and they know they're going to win everything.
Well, there are internal problems in China at the moment, and the big thing for China is always that it needs to sort of create 25 million new jobs a year. The notion that it's going to surpass the US in terms of its economy is looking more fragile. So it has its challenges, which it may have to sort of slightly ameliorate its position. But let's be clear, the Chinese Communist Party is there to make sure its rule endures. We'll do anything to make sure that happens in the future. So it's always going to be something which is malign. It is this sort of pinnacle of what we would call the CRINC countries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, as the sort of face of the authoritarian regimes, which will seek to challenge us in the future. Yep. There are weaknesses. I don't think, for example, that the Davison window, as we call it, a potential invasion of Taiwan, is anywhere near. And there are real challenges to that in terms of all the military aspects about, counter-submarine warfare, mine warfare, all the rest of it. So they're not as strong as they appear to be. They are weaker than they appear to be. The Belt and Road Initiative is not as strong as it was. People are sort of waking up to the indebtedness that the Belt and Road Initiative brings. So don't paint China as a country. It's really not. It's a malign country. It's not as strong as we often think.
Chip, thank you very much indeed. Lord Alton, final word to you about where we're at and where we're going on this.
Well, first, we do have to see, as we've just heard, the strategic nature of the threat that is facing us. We must do more with our allies. For instance, the government announced yesterday a couple of more sanctions. There have been no officials in Hong Kong sanctioned. Our United States allies have sanctioned over 47. Why aren't we doing these things together? Why aren't we working more closely with our allies?
Why aren't we?
Well, if you take the example of Huawei or Hikvision, both of which I raised, of course, in Parliament at the time, we went ahead and did those things because it suited the gravy train that was moving. And as a consequence of that, it's cost taxpayers in this country vast sums of money to get out of it. The same will be true of electric cars and the batteries and everything else that China is going to try and flood our markets with, some of it made by slave labour. If goods at least had to be marked, for instance, as made in a state accused by the House of Commons of committing genocide and made by slave labour, at least consumers would be able to decide whether they wanted to buy them or not.
Just lastly, does the Prime Minister need to come out and call China a threat instead of a challenge?
Yes, he does.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Your views, very welcome. gbviews@gbnews.com.